My neighbor called the police on me for suspicious behavior in my own backyard. Turns out she'd been watching my house for a very different reason the whole time. Two patrol cars pulled into my driveway at 1:40 in the morning, lights off but engines running, and I was standing in my own backyard at the time holding a garden trowel and a wooden box containing roughly half of what remained of my wife, having absolutely no idea that the woman across the street had been quietly documenting my house for 6 weeks before that exact moment, for reasons that had nothing to do with me at all, and everything to do with something considerably more dangerous than a grieving widower digging in his own flower bed at an hour when no reasonable person should be doing anything of the sort. My name is Frank Delaney. I'm 62 years old. I spent 31 years as a firefighter here in the Cincinnati area, retiring 4 years ago as a battalion chief. And I live alone now on a quiet cul-de-sac called Maple Hollow Court, in the same house my wife Carol and I bought together 26 years ago. A house that has felt, for the 8 months since Carol died, considerably too large and considerably too quiet for one person to occupy comfortably. I want to describe, briefly, what those 31 years actually shaped in me, because I think it matters for understanding my own reaction to everything that followed. Firefighting teaches you a specific, practical relationship to danger, a professional habit of assessing risk quickly and acting decisively rather than freezing in the face of uncertainty. And I want to be honest that this training did very little to prepare me for the particular, disorienting experience of standing in my own backyard being questioned by officers about my own behavior. A situation my 31 years of running toward other people's emergencies had never once required me to navigate from the opposite side. Carol used to tease me gently about how differently I handled crises that involved someone else's house versus crises that involved our own. A specific, accurate observation about a man who could walk calmly into a burning building, but who once spent an entire anxious evening convinced our own smoke detector's low battery chirp signaled something considerably more serious. I think about that particular teasing often now, standing in my own backyard that Tuesday night, understanding, with a specific irony Carol would have appreciated, exactly how disoriented I actually was by a crisis unfolding on my own property rather than someone else's. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Carol died of ALS, a disease that took 11 months to do what it does, methodically and without any real mercy. And I want to tell you about the specific thing I was doing in my backyard at 1:40 in the morning, because it matters for understanding everything that happened afterward. I want to describe those 11 months briefly, because I think they matter for understanding exactly how significant that dogwood tree request actually was to me. ALS is a disease that takes the body first and leaves the mind almost entirely intact for most of its progression. A specific, particular cruelty that meant Carol spent the better part of a year watching her own body fail her one function at a time, walking, then using her hands, then, in the final months, speaking clearly at all, while remaining fully, painfully aware of exactly what was happening to her. I became, over that year, a version of caretaker I never imagined I'd need to be, learning to read her communication board when her speech finally failed almost entirely, learning to manage a feeding tube and a specialized wheelchair, and the particular, exhausting choreography of keeping a dying woman comfortable in the house she loved. Carol had asked me, in one of her last genuinely clear conversations before the disease took her voice entirely, to scatter a portion of her ashes beneath the dogwood tree in our backyard, the one she'd planted herself the spring after we moved in, and to do it alone, quietly, without turning it into the kind of formal family gathering our children would have insisted on if I'd told them in advance. I had been putting it off for 8 months, unable to find the specific courage the task required, and that particular Tuesday night, unable to sleep, I had finally decided it was time. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Now let's get back to it. I want to describe what that night actually looked like from my own side of it, because I think the ordinary, private grief of it matters for understanding just how disorienting it was to have 2 patrol cars arrive in the middle of it. I'd taken the wooden box Carol's ashes were stored in down from our bedroom closet around 1 in the morning, poured myself a small glass of the bourbon we used to share on our anniversary, and walked out to the dogwood tree with a garden trowel, a flashlight, and considerably more emotion than I'd expected to feel doing something I'd been mentally rehearsing for 8 months. I was kneeling in the dirt beneath that tree, the flashlight propped against the trunk, working the trowel into ground that had gone considerably harder than I remembered from the last time I'd done any real gardening, when I heard a car door close somewhere across the street, followed, within a few minutes, by the specific, unmistakable sound of a police radio crackling somewhere nearby. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next part is where this story stops being simple. I want to describe the specific confusion of standing in my own backyard, ash-covered trowel in one hand, watching 2 patrol officers approach with flashlights of their own, asking me, with the careful, practiced neutrality officers use when they don't yet know what they are walking into, to step away from whatever I was digging and explain exactly what I was doing on my own property at nearly 2 in the morning. I remember the specific, disorienting sensation of those flashlight beams sweeping across my own backyard, a space that had felt, moments earlier, like the most private and personal place in my entire life, suddenly illuminated with the same harsh, procedural light officers used to search for evidence of a crime. I remember the younger officer's hand resting, not aggressively but unmistakably ready, near his own belt as he approached, a specific, professional caution that I understood intellectually, having spent 31 years as a firefighter responding to plenty of calls where the actual situation turned out to be considerably less dramatic than the initial report suggested. But that still landed in the moment, with a specific, unwelcome sting given what I'd actually been doing when they... I told them, as plainly as I could manage given how raw the moment already was, that I was scattering my late wife's ashes, a specific claim that I understood, even as I said it, sounded exactly like the kind of thing a person might say if they were trying to explain away something considerably less innocent. The younger of the two officers asked to see the wooden box, and I want to describe the specific, surreal indignity of standing in my own backyard at 2 in the morning, grief still raw and unprocessed, having a stranger in uniform examine a box containing my dead wife's remains to confirm I wasn't lying about what I was actually doing. He was gentle about it. I want to be fair. Clearly uncomfortable himself once he understood what he was actually looking at. His own expression shifting from professional wariness into something closer to genuine, embarrassed sympathy as he carefully opened the box's lid just enough to confirm its contents, before closing it again with a specific, respectful care that I noticed and appreciated even in the middle of everything else I was feeling. I remember his partner, a considerably younger officer who looked, in that moment, genuinely uncertain how to conduct himself, asking if I wanted them to step back while I finished. A small human kindness in the middle of an otherwise thoroughly humiliating night. I remember the specific weight of that wooden box back in my own hands afterward. The ash from Carol's remains now mixed, in my mind, with the memory of two strangers examining it under flashlight. A specific contamination of what should have been an entirely private, sacred moment that I've had a harder time fully letting go of than I initially expected. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. It was the older officer, a woman named Sergeant Patricia Vance, who finally asked the question that actually mattered, the one that reshaped everything I thought I understood about that entire night. I remember her specific, steady demeanor throughout the entire encounter, a woman who had clearly navigated hundreds of situations that started out looking alarming and turned out to be nothing at all, and who brought exactly the kind of calm, unhurried thoroughness that eventually let the actual, more complicated truth of that night surface properly. "Mr. Delaney," she said, "the call that brought us out here came from your neighbor across the street." She reported what she described as a suspicious individual moving around your backyard with a flashlight, potentially digging near your foundation. I want to be straightforward with you. Given some other things going on in this neighborhood recently, we take calls like that pretty seriously right now, regardless of how this particular one turned out. I remember the specific way she delivered that last sentence, careful and measured, clearly choosing how much to reveal to a private citizen about an active investigation. And I remember my own confused, exhausted curiosity in that moment, standing in my own backyard past 2 in the morning, still processing the fact that I'd just proven my wife's ashes were genuinely my wife's ashes to two strangers, now being told there was apparently a considerably larger context. Private ritual had triggered such a serious response. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. I asked her what she meant by other things going on, and I want to describe the specific chill that ran through me standing in that backyard, ash still on my hands, hearing Sergeant Vance explain, carefully, that the department had been investigating a series of residential burglaries across 3 neighboring subdivisions over the preceding 2 months, a pattern that had specifically targeted homes belonging to older residents living alone, several of whom, she told me, had lost considerable collections of valuables, coins, firearms, jewelry, to what appeared to be a coordinated group who'd clearly done careful advance research on which homes were worth targeting before ever actually breaking in. I remember asking her, my voice sounding considerably steadier than I actually felt, whether any of those burglaries had happened on our own street, and I remember her careful, professionally measured answer, that she wasn't able to share the specific details of an active investigation, but that the department was taking the entire area seriously enough to treat calls like the one that had brought her to my backyard with genuine urgency rather than routine dismissal. I stood there, absorbing that information alongside everything else that strange night had already required me to absorb, understanding that whatever had happened to bring 2 patrol cars into my driveway was apparently connected to something considerably larger than one confused neighbor's misread shadow. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to tell you about my own collection now, because I think it matters for understanding exactly why Maple Hollow Court, and my house specifically, had apparently already caught the attention of exactly the kind of people Sergeant Vance was describing. My father, who died 9 years ago, had spent most of his adult life collecting antique firearms, a specific, careful hobby he'd pursued for nearly 5 decades, building a collection that an appraiser had once valued, informally, at somewhere north of $200,000, a collection I had inherited in full and kept, largely unchanged, in a specialized display case in what used to be our home office. I remember my father's specific, quiet devotion to that collection throughout my own childhood, weekend trips to gun shows across 3 states, careful hours spent researching provenance and condition before any acquisition, a hobby that had never once, in my experience of it growing up, felt like anything other than a genuine scholarly passion rather than simple accumulation. He kept meticulous records on every piece, handwritten index cards detailing each firearm's manufacture date, historical context, and acquisition story. Records I still had, organized in the same wooden card file box he'd used for decades, sitting on a shelf beside the display case itself. I had, about 4 months earlier, made what I now understand was a specific, costly mistake, hiring a well-regarded local auction house to appraise the collection for updated insurance purposes, a process that had required, at various points, technicians visiting my house directly to photograph and catalog individual pieces, and that had apparently generated considerably more visibility around my address and my specific, valuable inventory than I had any. I remember the appraisal visits themselves as genuinely pleasant experiences, 2 technicians spending the better part of 2 full days carefully documenting each piece, expressing real appreciation for my father's specific expertise and care in building the collection. And I remember feeling, at the time, a quiet satisfaction watching professionals confirm what I'd always understood, growing up, about how genuinely significant my father's lifelong hobby had actually become. I had no way of knowing, watching those two ordinary professional days unfold, that they were also, apparently, generating exactly the kind of visibility that would eventually put my house on a considerably more dangerous kind of radar. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. I did not know, standing in my backyard that night with Sergeant Vance, that the woman who had called the police, my neighbor across the street, was not simply a nervous stranger reacting to an unfamiliar shadow in my yard. I met her 3 days later when she knocked on my door, visibly nervous, wanting to apologize in person for what had happened. And it was during that specific, awkward doorstep conversation that I learned exactly who Renata Ackhaffer actually was, and exactly why she had been watching my house considerably more closely than any ordinary neighbor reasonably would. I remember opening my front door that Friday evening to find her standing on my porch, holding a small potted plant, an offering that struck me in the moment as a specific, slightly formal gesture from a woman who was clearly working through exactly how to apologize for an incident that had, however unintentionally, exposed a stranger's most private grief to two armed police officers in the middle of the night. She introduced herself properly for the first time, having only ever exchanged the briefest of neighborly waves during her first 3 months on the street, and I remember the specific care she took explaining herself, choosing her words slowly, clearly rehearsed in advance, the particular carefulness of someone accustomed to delivering difficult information professionally. I invited her inside, and I remember the specific, slightly awkward first few minutes of that conversation, both of us settling into my living room with the careful formality of two people who understood they were about to have a considerably more significant conversation than either had initially expected from a simple apology visit. I made coffee, mostly to give my hands something to do while I processed exactly how to feel about the woman who had, 3 nights earlier, been the reason two officers examined my dead wife's ashes under flashlight, and I remember her declining a second cup, clearly aware that she still had the harder part of her explanation ahead of her. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. Renata is 54, moved into the house across the street about 3 months before that Tuesday night, and spent 22 years as a detective with the Cincinnati Police Department before retiring the previous year, the last 11 of those years working specifically in the department's property crimes unit, investigating exactly the kind of organized residential burglary rings that Sergeant Vance had described to me in my own backyard. I remember the specific way her posture shifted, standing on my porch, once she began describing her professional background, a subtle but unmistakable transition from apologetic neighbor into someone speaking with the particular authority of genuine expertise. And I remember understanding, watching that shift, that whatever she was about to tell me was going to require my full attention. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to describe what Renata told me, standing on my own front porch 3 days after the worst night of confusion I'd experienced since Carol's funeral, because it reorganized my entire understanding of everything that had happened. She told me she had noticed, within her first few weeks of living on Maple Hollow Court, a specific pattern that her 22 years of property crimes experience made almost impossible for her not to register. A white panel van, unmarked, appearing on our street roughly once a week, always during daylight hours when most residents were at work, parked just long enough for its occupant to walk a slow, apparently casual lap of the cul-de-sac. The specific, practiced behavior of someone conducting reconnaissance rather than simply passing through. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. Renata told me she had started, almost as a private habit rather than any official investigation, keeping her own informal log of that van's appearances, noting dates and approximate times, a specific vigilance built from decades of professional instinct that she said she hadn't been able to simply switch off after retirement. However much she'd initially told herself, she was done with exactly this kind of work. I remember her describing on that porch the specific texture of her early retirement. A stretch of months, she said, had felt considerably stranger than she'd anticipated. A career built around constant, purposeful vigilance, suddenly replaced by the ordinary quiet of an empty afternoon, with nothing urgent requiring her attention. She told me she'd moved to Maple Hollow Court, specifically hoping for exactly that kind of quiet. A fresh start in a neighborhood with no professional history attached to it, and that noticing the white van's first appearance, only a few weeks into her new life here, had triggered a specific, almost involuntary reactivation of instincts she genuinely hoped might finally rest. She had noticed, too, something she said had specifically drawn her attention to my house among the dozen or so homes on our cul-de-sac. The auction house technician's visits 4 months earlier, vehicles she'd recognized from her years working property crimes as belonging to a legitimate, well-regarded appraisal firm, but whose presence, combined with everything else she'd been quietly tracking, had made my house specifically stand out to her as a home that had likely, however unintentionally, generated exactly the kind of visibility that made it an attractive target for the pattern she believed she was watching develop. I want to describe the specific, unsettling clarity of understanding, standing on my own porch, that a professionally trained eye had been watching my house with genuine concern for weeks, drawing conclusions about my own vulnerability that I'd had absolutely no awareness of forming in the background of my own quiet, grief-heavy daily routine. I asked Renata how she'd first noticed the specific pattern with the van, and she described, in careful detail, the particular training that lets an experienced property crimes detective distinguish between an ordinary delivery driver checking an address and someone conducting deliberate reconnaissance. The specific way the van's occupant walked, slow and observational rather than purposeful. The way he seemed to pause longest in front of homes with certain visible characteristics. The particular pattern of returning to the same few houses across multiple visits rather than the random distribution an ordinary lost driver or door-to-door salesperson would produce. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. I want to describe what Renata had actually done with this growing suspicion, because I think it matters for understanding both her genuine concern for my safety and the specific, careful professional discipline she'd maintained even in retirement. She had not called the police about the van itself, not yet, understanding from decades of experience that an unmarked white van driving slowly through a suburban cul-de-sac wasn't, on its own, sufficient grounds for any kind of official action, however suspicious her own trained instincts told her it looked. I remember her explaining this specific restraint to me with a kind of professional pride, telling me that one of the hardest lessons her career had taught her was the discipline of not acting on instinct alone, no matter how strong, until she had something more concrete to actually work with. A specific caution that had, she said, saved her from more than one embarrassing false alarm earlier in her career, and that she'd carried forward almost automatically. Even after retirement had removed any formal obligation to exercise it. Instead, she had quietly reached out to a former colleague still active on the force, a detective named Marcus Boone, who had worked alongside her for nearly 15 years, sharing her informal observations and asking him to keep an unofficial eye on whether similar patterns were showing up in any active property crimes investigations. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button because it really does help the channel keep going. Marcus Boone, it turned out, was already several weeks into exactly the kind of investigation Renata suspected, working the string of residential burglaries Sergeant Vance had described to me in my own backyard, and Renata's informal log of the white van's appearances on Maple Hollow Court, once she shared it with him, matched a specific vehicle description that had already surfaced in at least 2 other burglary reports from neighboring subdivisions. A match significant enough that Marcus had begun, quietly, treating our entire cul-de-sac as a likely upcoming target rather than simply one possibility among many. I want to describe what Renata told me about Marcus Boone himself, because their professional partnership across 15 years had apparently built the specific kind of trust that let this entire informal collaboration function as effectively as it did. She described him as one of the most methodical investigators she'd ever worked alongside, a man who'd built his own considerable reputation within the department, specifically around exactly this kind of pattern-based property crimes work, treating each individual burglary not as an isolated incident, but as one data point in a larger, evolving picture that required patience and careful cross-referencing to fully understand. Marcus, once Renata shared her observations, apparently spent the better part of a week independently verifying the specific details she'd provided, cross-referencing the van's description against traffic camera footage from the neighboring subdivisions where the earlier burglaries had occurred, work that eventually confirmed, with a considerably higher degree of confidence than either Renata's informal instinct or my own retroactive alarm could have provided on their own. That the same vehicle had indeed been documented near at least 3 of the earlier crime scenes in the weeks preceding each respective break-in. I want to describe the specific, sobering weight of learning all of this, standing on my own porch, understanding that a professional law enforcement investigation, running in parallel to my own private grief for weeks, had been quietly converging on the exact conclusion that my own quiet cul-de-sac, and specifically my own house, sat squarely within its path. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button because it really does help the channel keep going. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe because what happens next is the part I still think about most. Renata told me that afternoon on my porch that the specific night I'd been in my own backyard scattering Carol's ashes had actually aligned, uncomfortably, with a pattern she'd noted in the van's visits. Its most recent appearance had been just 4 days earlier, and her own informal tracking suggested the gap between a final reconnaissance visit and an actual break-in attempt, based on the other reported cases Marcus had shared with her, tended to run somewhere between 3. Seeing unexplained movement and a flashlight in my backyard at nearly 2 in the morning, that specific night, had genuinely alarmed her, not because she suspected me of anything, but because she'd feared in the moment that whoever had been casing my house for weeks had finally decided to move. I want to describe the specific, complicated gratitude I felt, standing on that porch, understanding that the humiliating, disorienting experience of being questioned in my own backyard, while grieving had actually been the direct result of a woman I barely knew taking my safety seriously enough to build weeks of careful, unofficial vigilance around it, entirely without my knowledge, expecting nothing in return. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I asked Renata that afternoon what happened next, now that her suspicions and Marcus Boone's active investigation had apparently converged on my own street. She told me Marcus had, in the days since my backyard incident, formally opened Maple Hollow Court as an active surveillance zone, working with a small team to establish discreet monitoring of the cul-de-sac's regular traffic patterns, hoping to catch the white van, or whoever was driving it, in the act of returning for what both Renata and Marcus now believed was likely to be an actual break-in attempt, given how thoroughly the location appeared to have already been scouted. I remember asking her, somewhat nervously, whether that meant my own house specifically was likely to be the target, and I want to describe her answer, because it carried a specific, careful honesty I came to appreciate considerably more once I understood how much of her career had been built around exactly this kind of difficult conversation. She told me she couldn't promise me it wouldn't be, that the specific combination of my father's valuable collection and the visibility the appraisal visit had generated made my house a genuinely plausible target, but that Marcus's team was now actively watching, in a way that gave all of us a considerably better chance of catching whoever was responsible before they successfully took anything at all. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. The following 3 weeks were, I want to be honest, some of the strangest of my adult life. Living in my own house with the specific low-grade awareness that unmarked surveillance was operating somewhere on my quiet residential street, watching for a threat I couldn't see and had no way of anticipating the timing of. I remember the particular way that awareness reshaped my ordinary daily habits during that stretch, catching myself checking my own windows and door locks with a specific vigilance I'd never needed before, glancing at unfamiliar cars parked on our street with a wariness that felt, at times, almost paranoid, even though I understood, intellectually, that the actual watching being done was for my protection rather than against it. Renata and I talked considerably more during that stretch than two neighbors ordinarily would, a specific, unexpected friendship developing out of genuinely strange circumstances, her professional experience giving me a kind of steady, informed calm that I found I badly needed during those particular weeks. We started having coffee together most mornings, an easy, unplanned habit that began, I think, simply because we were both awake earlier than the rest of the street and found, once we started talking regularly, that we genuinely enjoyed each other's company beyond the specific circumstances that had first brought us into contact. I learned during those morning coffees considerably more about Renata's own life than the professional details that had first connected us, that she'd never married, had built her entire adult identity around a career she genuinely loved even through its hardest, most difficult cases, and that her own retirement, however voluntarily chosen, had left her with a specific, unexpected grief of her own, a loss of professional purpose she said she was still learning how to navigate. I remember one particular morning, maybe 2 weeks into our new routine, when she told me about a specific case early in her career that she still thought about. A burglary victim whose family heirloom jewelry was never recovered despite her best efforts. A specific professional failure she said had shaped, in ways she was still discovering, exactly how seriously she took every subsequent case that crossed her desk. She described that early case in more detail than I expected. An elderly widow, not unlike myself in the specific shape of her loss, whose late husband's watch collection had been taken during a burglary Renata had worked as a rookie detective. A case that had gone cold within months despite her own considerable efforts. The specific pieces never recovered, the widow never receiving the closure Renata had wanted desperately to give her. She told me she still remembered that woman's face, decades later, the particular grief of losing not just valuable objects but a physical connection to a marriage that had ended. I understood, hearing her describe that old, unresolved case, exactly why my own house, once she'd noticed the specific warning signs, had mattered enough to her that she'd built weeks of careful, unofficial vigilance around protecting it. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I told her, in turn, more about Carol than I'd told almost anyone since the funeral, understanding, somewhere during those 3 strange weeks, that Renata had become someone I genuinely trusted with the fuller, more complicated shape of my own grief. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. The break-in attempt happened on a Thursday night, 19 days after the incident in my backyard, and I want to describe what actually happened, because it did not unfold the way I'd anticipated during those 3 anxious weeks of waiting. I was asleep, entirely unaware, when Marcus Boone's surveillance team spotted the white van parking 2 streets over around 11 that night. Its 2 occupants approaching Maple Hollow Court on foot rather than driving directly to any specific house. A careful, practiced approach that Marcus later told me was consistent with exactly the kind of professional operation his team had suspected they were dealing with from the start. The 2 men were apprehended in my own backyard, having already begun working at the lock on my back door, less than 8 minutes after Marcus's team first spotted them approaching on foot, an arrest that happened, I learned later, close enough to my own bedroom window that I genuinely cannot believe I slept through the entire thing, waking only to the specific, disorienting sound of my doorbell at nearly midnight. I remember stumbling downstairs in the particular fog of being woken from a deep sleep, genuinely uncertain for a confused moment whether I was dreaming some strange echo of the earlier incident, before I opened the door and found Renata standing on my porch in her own pajamas and a jacket, telling me with visible relief that it was over, that the men responsible for weeks of careful reconnaissance and at least 4 other successful burglaries had just been taken into custody in my own backyard, less than 30 feet from where I'd been kneeling with a garden trowel 3 weeks earlier. I remember the specific, surreal quality of standing in my own doorway at midnight, watching flashing lights reflect off my neighbors' houses, understanding that an actual crime had been prevented in progress at the exact door I'd walked through thousands of times without ever once considering how vulnerable it actually was. Marcus Boone himself came by briefly that same night, still in his work clothes, to walk me through the basic outline of what had happened, a courtesy I understood, watching his exhausted but genuinely satisfied expression wasn't strictly required of him, but that he'd wanted to offer given how directly my own house had ended up at the center of his investigation's culmination. I remember shaking his hand that night, a tall, weathered man in his late 50s who carried himself with the specific, unhurried authority of someone who'd spent decades handling exactly this kind of high-stakes, carefully coordinated operation. And I remember his first words to me, a simple, genuine "glad we got here in time, Mr. Delaney," delivered with a warmth that told me, even in my exhausted state, exactly how personally invested he'd become in the case that had brought him to my own backyard at midnight. He told me the 2 men had been under discreet observation for nearly 2 hours before finally approaching my property, giving his team ample time to position themselves without alerting either the suspects or, notably, me. A specific operational decision, he explained, had been necessary to avoid any risk of the suspects noticing unusual activity and aborting before they could actually be caught in the act. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to describe what I learned over the following weeks about the two men Marcus's team had arrested, because the fuller picture turned out to be considerably more organized than I'd initially imagined standing in my own driveway that midnight. The operation, it turned out, had been running for nearly 8 months across 4 different jurisdictions, specifically targeting elderly and widowed homeowners with documented valuable collections. Information the ring had been gathering in several cases through exactly the kind of legitimate appraisal and estate service visibility that had unwittingly put my own house on their radar. Marcus explained during a longer conversation about 2 weeks after the arrest that investigators had found, once they'd obtained warrants to search the suspect's vehicle and a storage unit connected to one of them, a specific, methodical system for identifying targets, clippings and printouts from estate sale listings, insurance appraisal firm websites, and even, disturbingly, several local news obituaries that mentioned surviving spouses and family collections. Cold-blooded research process that had apparently identified my father's firearms collection through the exact auction house appraisal I'd arranged months earlier. Likely, Marcus believed, through a compromised employee or a data breach the firm itself hadn't yet discovered. I want to describe what it felt like, learning that specific detail, understanding that a legitimate business I'd trusted with my father's carefully documented legacy had somehow, unknowingly, become the exact vector that put my house at risk. A specific betrayal of trust that I've since worked through with the auction house directly, who conducted their own internal investigation once I informed them, and eventually confirmed a former employee had, in fact, been selling client information to exactly this kind of criminal network for nearly a year before being caught. I met with the auction house's owner myself, several weeks after the arrest, a genuinely mortified man who walked me through the specific security changes his firm had implemented since discovering the breach. New access controls limiting which employees could view complete client address and inventory records, and a considerably more rigorous background screening process for anyone handling exactly the kind of sensitive information that had, in my case, apparently traveled from his own files into the hands of a criminal network targeting vulnerable homeowners. I remember him offering, near the end of that meeting, to waive the remaining balance I owed on the original appraisal fee, a gesture I initially declined, telling him the work itself had been genuinely professional and thorough, the failure lying entirely with a dishonest employee rather than the quality of service I'd actually received. He insisted, eventually, and I accepted, understanding it mattered to him in some genuine way to offer some concrete gesture of accountability beyond simply apologizing. I appreciated his genuine remorse, though I want to be honest that it took me considerably longer than that single meeting to fully trust the firm again. A specific caution that felt, given everything that had happened, entirely reasonable to maintain. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. Marcus told me the investigation eventually connected this ring to at least 11 confirmed burglaries across the greater Cincinnati area, with a combined value of stolen goods that investigators estimated at well over $400,000. Several of the earlier victims' elderly homeowners, who had, unlike me, actually lost irreplaceable family collections before anyone connected the pattern that eventually saved my own house from the same fate. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. I want to describe what it felt like, learning that my father's carefully preserved collection, the specific, tangible connection I'd maintained to a man dead 9 years, had come within what investigators later estimated was probably days of being permanently lost, and that the only reason it hadn't been was a retired detective's inability to fully switch off decades of professional instinct even in the quiet routine of an ordinary suburban retirement. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. I didn't know, standing in my own backyard that first strange, humiliating night with ash still on my hands, that the woman calling the police on me was going to become, over the following months, one of the more genuinely important people in my life. A friendship built out of the strangest possible circumstances that neither of us could have anticipated. I didn't know that Marcus Boone's expanding investigation into the burglary ring was going to eventually uncover a connection to a considerably larger network operating across 3 states, one that federal investigators were going to take over entirely within the following year. A case that Renata told me, months later, she still followed closely, unable to fully leave behind the specific, careful vigilance that had defined more than 2 decades of her working life. I didn't know, either, that federal investigators, once they eventually absorbed the case into their own broader investigation, were going to reach out to Renata directly the following spring, curious whether she'd be willing to consult, informally, on a handful of similar cases in neighboring states. A specific, unofficial return to exactly the kind of work she'd told me, on my own front porch. She genuinely hoped retirement might finally let her leave behind for. But that's a story for next time. The truest thing I can tell you, nearly a year removed from that strange, disorienting Tuesday night, is that grief and safety turned out to be more intertwined in my own life than I ever would have guessed, standing beneath that dogwood tree with a garden trowel in my hand. I went out to my backyard that night carrying nothing but my wife's ashes and 8 months of unprocessed loss, and I came away from the following 3 weeks with something I hadn't expected to find in the middle of my own private grief. A genuine friendship, a neighborhood considerably safer than I'd realized it wasn't, and a specific, hard-won understanding that the people who seem from a distance to be watching us too closely are sometimes the exact people quietly working hardest to keep us safe. Renata and I still have coffee most mornings, a habit that has long since, outlasted the original circumstances that first brought us together, settling into something considerably more ordinary and considerably more valuable than either of us expected when we first started talking regularly during those strange, anxious weeks. She's told me more than once since that watching my father's collection nearly become another entry in her old case files was one of the more personally motivating outcomes of her entire career. A specific, tangible reminder of exactly why the work she'd spent 22 years doing had mattered, even in the quiet, uncelebrated moments that never made it into any official report. I finished scattering Carol's ashes eventually, on a considerably calmer afternoon about a month after the arrest, this time with Renata standing quietly a respectful distance away, having asked gently whether I wanted company for the second attempt, understanding, I think, exactly how much the first attempt's disruption had cost me emotionally, and wanting to offer, this time, the kind of steady, unobtrusive presence that let me finally complete what Carol had actually asked. I remember standing beneath that dogwood tree that second time, the same tree, the same soil, finally undisturbed by flashlights or radios or any of the strange machinery of that first disorienting night, and feeling, for the first time in 8 months, that I had genuinely honored what Carol wanted, in the quiet, private way she'd specifically asked for. I think often about how differently this entire year might have unfolded if Renata had simply been the ordinary, disengaged neighbor I might have expected on any other quiet suburban street. Someone who noticed nothing, tracked nothing, and never once thought to connect a slow-moving white van to anything beyond mild, passing curiosity. I think about my father's collection, sitting today exactly where he left it, protected not by any alarm system or insurance policy, but by the simple, stubborn professional instinct of a retired detective who never quite learned how to stop paying attention. Renata Ockhafer called the police on me because she was afraid, that night, that the man she'd been secretly, carefully protecting for weeks was in genuine danger. I have never once in the year since found a way to fully thank her for being right to worry. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Thanks for being here, for real.